Here we are. Wonderful. Transcript, participants. Hi, everyone. If you're joining us for our event with Leona Godin and Maggie Nelson, you are in the right place. We're going to get started in just a moment here. You'll note too, hello, everyone. You'll note too that we are also joined by our ASL interpreters, Ari and Beth. Thank you, Ari and Beth. And I'd like to welcome us all by saying hello. My name is Car. I'm the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. And in my hands, I have a copy of Leona Godin's book, Their Plant Eyes, a personal and cultural history of blindness. It is a purple ombre cover, magenta, or mauve. We haven't quite decided, but it's quite lovely. And you can pick up a copy actually on our website at greenapplebooks.com. And it will come with, if you get it as soon as possible, it will come with a signed book plate, which also includes in braille here, the words "down with ocularcentrism." It's perhaps the coolest book plate that I have ever.
Yeah.
And it's a really beautifully designed book. So you can grab a copy of that for yourself. So you folks know, I'm Car. I'm a non-binary person with short brown hair and shaved sides. I'm wearing a green turtleneck sweater, and behind me is a bookshelf and a navy blue wall with a wood paneling behind me. I wanted to tell you all about a couple of events that we have coming up here at Green Apple. On Tuesday, June 8th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, Cheney Kwok will be joined here by the author Daniel Handler to celebrate the release of his book, The Passenger. And Cheney was on a notoriously stuck cruise ship, and this is his book about that experience on a notoriously stuck cruise ship. We're excited to share that this event will be broadcast live from Green Apple Books on the park. We will also have signed and personalized copies of Cheney's book available. So that will be next Tuesday, June 8th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, right here in beautiful San Francisco, California. We have a full calendar of events on our website at greenapplebooks.com. All of our events are free unless stated otherwise. That being said, if you can, please do buy books. I can think of at least one book that you can buy, that being Their Plant Eyes, which I'm holding up right now. If you can, it supports us as a store, as an independent bookstore in the year 2021. It supports these writers who have worked so hard and put so much of their heart and time into writing these books. And at the end of it, you get a book out of it, which might be the most important part. So if you can, please do support us and buy our authors' books. I wanted to encourage you folks to use the Q&A function this evening and ask a question anytime it comes to mind. That can be at any point during the hour. We don't want you to lose your thought, and we will get to them at the end of our time together. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the authors joining us this evening. First, I'd like to introduce Maggie Nelson. Maggie is the author of 9 books of poetry and prose, many of which have become cult classics defying categorization. She first published the book Bluets with Wave Books in 2009. In 2015, Book Forum named Bluets one of the top 10 books of the past 20 years. Her other nonfiction titles include the National Book Critics Circle Award book winner, The Argonauts, The Art of Cruelty, A Reckoning, The Red Parts, Autobiography of a Trial, and Women, The New York School, and Other True Abstractions. Her poetry titles include Something Bright, Then Holes, and Jane, a Murder. She writes frequently on art, and in 2016 was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She currently lives in Los Angeles. We're very pleased to have her join us. Please welcome Maggie Nelson. And I'll introduce to our author this evening. Hi, Maggie. Leona Godin is a writer, performer, and educator who is blind. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, Oh, the Oprah Magazine, and Catapult, where she writes the column A Blind Writer's Notebook. She was a 2019 Logan Nonfiction Fellow and has written and produced 2 theatrical productions, The Star of Happiness, based on Helen Keller's time performing on vaudeville, and The Spectator and the Blind Man, about the invention of Braille. She founded the online magazine Aromatica Poetica as a venue for exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, not specifically for, but welcoming to blind readers and writers. She holds a PhD in literature from NYU and has lectured on art, accessibility, disability, and technology at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, Rice University, and the American Printing House for the Blind, among other venues. Her book, Their Plant Eyes, A Personal and Cultural History of Blindness, is the reason we're here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Leona Godin. Thank you. Folks.
All right, this is such a pleasure. This is Maggie Nelson kicking in here. And hi, I just want to say that I am a brown-haired person with her hair in a ponytail and a very strange, like Victorian-esque shirt that's also green and white tie-dye, sitting in also a rented place. So I have a lot of kind of salon-like paintings behind me of not of my choosing, and a wooden desk. And I am thrilled to be here with you, Leona, and we know each other only slightly. We've met, I don't know,
long time ago,
20 years ago and, or something. Anyway, but I was really thrilled when you reached out and sent me this book, or inquired about it and then sent it to me. I love it. I think it's super great. And I encourage everybody here to get it and to read it. And so I was really moved by it and really edified. So I was really excited to do this event with you tonight.
Oh, and I am so appreciative.
Good. Well, I just wanted to, I also wanted to spend more time with it because it really merits it, and so we don't have that long to talk. We're going to talk for about, I guess about a half an hour and change, and then we'll ask any questions from you guys. And so please, as they said, put them in the Q&A. But I just, I don't know where to start. I guess one place to start.
Maggie, but let me do my image description. let me, because I need to talk about all the purple that everyone's so excited about. So I am a brown-haired person as well. I've got some purple sunglasses on. I am wearing a black dress with a little cameo, a little vintagey kind of cameo. And behind me is apparently a purple wall, but some people call it mauve, who knows. And there's some nice flowers back there. And my book is propped up back there, strategically placed. So thank you so much, Maggie. So take it away.
Okay, great. Well, I guess, I think one of the many achievements of your book that I was very struck by was its style and its tone. And I felt like, I loved how you're almost courtly at times, where you do some dear readers and I should not speak for all, this kind of mode. And then there's kind of pedagogical mode where you're just, really giving us great history. And then there's some activist sentiment that's kind of delivered with a light touch. And there's a lot of different tones. And I know some of the pieces, or I'm guessing from reading the back matter, were written in and around for different things, but you've really ironed it all together to really feeling like all part of one whole. So I guess I was just curious to hear you talk about putting it together. And also, we have in common that we both got PhDs at some point, and then probably both realized that we didn't
Ran away.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if but you said, I can't remember your phrase, just that like you realized that it wasn't going to be like a home for you. But I wondered,
Right.
clearly from your writing in here, and your description of your master's thesis and other things, clearly you became a very elegant literary critic, while also learning vis-a-vis whether it's Playboy or wherever other ways of writing. So I was just curious if you could talk more about style and tone and how you learned how to put all these, how to kind of bring this all together.
Oh, goodness. Well, you're absolutely right. So this is kind of 20 years in the making at least. And so there are parts in Their Plant Eyes that are very much in the pocket of my dissertation. So 17th, 18th century literature, hopefully made much more accessible in this book than in my dissertation. There are parts even kind of going back to my very first encounter with kind of the blind trope in classical literature. So that was kind of me as an undergrad first encountering both sort of the idea of the blind poet prophet, and also Milton. That was my first kind of Milton class way back then. And then, during grad school, at some point, I kind of realized that maybe academia was not totally for me. And I started frequenting open mics in the Lower East Side, kind of doing everything from like comedy to loop pedals to who knows what. And so as I was finishing my dissertation, I just stumbled upon this quote about Helen Keller and about her performing in vaudeville. And I was like, wow, I need to do something with this. Like, as an artist, I've written enough academic stuff. Thank you very much. Let's deal with this material in a new way. So this book, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you say that it kind of all ironed itself out, because there have been very messy versions of this book for sure, because there are so many different approaches to the same material that I've kind of taken with me through the years. So, I mean, I got to give credit to my editor, because of course there was some reining into the messiness. But in the end, I really thought it was important to have those kinds of different approaches, those different perspectives on this material, because it speaks to sort of my experience, because I feel like I'm very much like the blind guide in this material. And so I wanted to make sure that there were sort of very open approaches, I guess, to the historical and literary stuff.
It really does feel ironed together. I mean, I feel like it feels, there's never a moment where you think, I mean, I actually feel like when you say the guide, like, you're really, if you look back on it, you're really moving us through time, from ancient times to the present. And it's a very, leisurely, but, swift, at the same time, pace through a lot of time in literature and cultural history. It's just, I think it's really amazing. And I mean, I also wonder about writing the book, like choosing to collect all this together. At the end, near the end, you have a really, eloquent whole part on stigma, and you write about, you're talking about resisting using a cane in public, and you write about fearing the look of blindness more than fearing for, one's life. And then you describe that you partly wrote the book to throw off the shackles of stigma. And then you also address elsewhere the ways in which people with some salient feature that's treated as non-normative are always expected to write only about that thing. And obviously, I'm sure people here know that have probably experienced that coming up around gender or race or disability or whatever it is that the culture wants to have be the only thing that's seen about somebody. So I guess my question is, in putting together what you're going to call a personal and cultural history of blindness, did you ever feel any internal conflict about taking blindness as your primary focus, or was it very obvious this was the text that needed to be written for you and that's that,
Gosh, yeah, it's hard because I've been playing again with some of these ideas for so long that yes, definitely the blindness was going to be a thing. I never really went into this with any ideas of memoir per se. So I always felt like I always felt like blindness was going to be the heart of it, and that my personal experience would kind of help to shape the this vast swath of of cultural history. Again, from there was one title that got poo-pooed pretty quickly by my agent, where I wanted to call it From Homer to Me. He said, well, it's a bit grandiose. And of course, all of my friends were like, well, yeah. So, so the shaping of it, though, I will say this, though, there was a bit of tension in the beginning of sort of like, first, I didn't know which timeline to follow. I didn't know whether to follow my own life timeline and really bring in the cultural stuff, or the other way around. And I think that sort of in earlier, messier versions of this, it was kind of trying to do both things at the same time. And it just, that's why it was so messy, because I wanted to try and have some sort of timeline in my own life that somehow mirrored like this historical timeline. And it just didn't work. So it was very much a conscious decision that I was going to follow the historical timeline, make the big jumps and all of that, and that my voice would really be anecdotal rather than trying to be coherent in a memoir kind of a sense. But yeah, blindness.
Very natural.
Oh, good. But yeah, blindness was always there. It was always gonna. I feel like I've got more to do with blindness. Like my big thing is I'm working on a novel, and there's going to be some blind characters there.
I was also thinking, I mean, I know this is a very typical question right now, but I too had a book going into production during COVID, and I felt some kinship in noticing like the kind of, your book is out a few months earlier than mine, but like, there was kind of only time to sprinkle, a couple things about the pandemic before the production process went down. But I couldn't help but think about themes in your book. I think any good book, it's not like, oh, bummer, it couldn't talk about the pandemic. It's like your book actually talks about all these things that then have come up in the pandemic because it's a good book that touches on important things. And I guess three of them I just wanted to throw out to you and to wonder if you had any thoughts about. One is kind of the mega eruption of a shared, if totally unevenly distributed, sense of vulnerability and the creation of a kind of large class of, possibly newly disabled people with long COVID. The second is the relationship between touch and sight in the pandemic, and how so much early writing about the pandemic talked about the removal of tactile life from the public, but I wasn't quite sure. I don't know. It just made me. But I thought you'd be interesting on that. And the third one was just about loss of smell, because you've done so much work in thinking about smell. So I don't know if any of those things were on your mind, or if there are other things that you've thought about since. But
oh goodness, yes. That was definitely a thing. I was during whatever 2020, that long year ago, way back then. There were actually we had illness in the family as well that was not COVID related. So it was kind of a pummeling and all, because there were still things like cancer happening even when COVID was happening. And so there was a lot of, yes, feelings of vulnerability for sure. And of course, there was so much going on in the disability activist community about getting access to care and who is allowed to have access to care, kind of sweeping decisions about who are sort of the most important people to treat. You know, there's this kind of like triage mentality or something that was so big that I was like, I want to say something, but if I say something, it'll feel more flip. And there are so many people doing really amazing work about this, you know, and it was kind of like, yes, it was a decision that I had to make to kind of leave the circumstances of the moment out of it, and hope that, yeah, there are threads that run along, ideas about disability, ideas about human rights, and, you know, who deserves our attention in a moment of crisis. You know, I mean, that's a big one, and I think we're still kind of hashing that out, you know. uh, should I take all three of these? I don't know. I don't know where to.
I mean, those were maybe
Oh, the touch
sharing.
thing. Oh, the touch thing is so interesting. Yeah. You know, I mean, as a writer, you kind of like, you can be very solitary. But I think it was important maybe for people to realize how important touch and smell were. You know, I'm a big proponent of thinking about these other senses and making sure, you know, as my book plate says, you know, sort of down with ocularcentrism is not about like not being visual and not celebrating the visual parts of us. It's about kind of recognizing that sight is just one sense among our five senses, and that to you know, to appreciate the other senses is also to allow for ideas like, you know, blind artists, you know, or blind scientists, right? It's not just about like, oh, it's so nice to, you know, stop and smell the flowers or whatever. It's really about realizing that our other senses need attention in a way that they just haven't gotten, even in a scientific lens. And so yeah, I mean, I think if there is kind of you know, a silver lining to the whole COVID thing, I think appreciating that actually we are more than our kind of our sight, you know, more than our screens, and that we do need these other senses that we so often just kind of neglect or forget about, and don't you know, get poetic about as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting, and I think your book is, you know, most insistent and convincing and most moving on this issue of insisting on spectrum rather than dichotomy, you know. And I think because, I mean, as you say, this is the concept, you know, of attending to particularity and to into spectrum, incompleteness, you know, different aspects of you know, non-binary thinking, i.e. darkness, light,
Yes.
sighted, blind. I mean, I think, I mean, as you say in the book, it's clearly applicable to many spheres, but your focus on sight, it affords you a number of I think, very beautiful figures of speech. And I think dappled is probably my favorite among them. And you use it a couple times, and I love your phrase, vast dappled regions. And I just wondered, you know, I mean, to me, I'm kind of I'm like your ideal, like, you know, you had me at dappled, like kind of a reader, in that, like, I'm very with you on this train, but I couldn't help but wonder, and like, just if you had any more thoughts. I mean, there's plenty in the book, but more thoughts about why people so often avoid or skip over or devalue it. And I don't, and I felt like there's kind of a discourse in your book about time and labor and patience, and like the time that it takes to attend to the particular. And there's also a little bit of like, you're not a very psychoanalytic writer, I kind of noticed, but you kind of you touch lightly on psychoanalysis, you know. But I did notice that, you know, I mean, I do think you are making a kind of argument lightly, but about the kinds of fantasies and fears that are revealed by this all or nothing thinking, like in Rather Be Dead Than Blind, or a kind of like way in which some dependence bleeds into all dependence, or like a little need bleeds into,
Right.
a terrifying state of, infantile vulnerability that's going to,
Yeah.
and I just wondered if you had, I don't know, just more thoughts on like the dapple is so amazing. So why so much labor spent avoiding it, avoiding paying attention to
Hmm.
it.
Well, I mean, binaries, let's face it, they are easier. I mean, they just are, it's yes, it's yes, no, it's black, white, it's blind-sided. I mean,
Right,
it's just easier. And I think,
right.
especially in our modern era, but I think it's probably always been true for humans, that it's just like to nuance everything is very hard, right? And you can't necessarily put a nuanced spin on everything that comes your way, but I think that you do have to like allow that there are things that you don't know, and I think that's kind of a big theme in this book too, right? You can't see what you can't see, you can't know what you can't know, but I think admitting that what you don't know, that what you see as a monolith, like a blind person either in a movie or on the street, what you may feel is monolithic is
Mhm.
not, right? Allowing for the knowledge that everything, when you just do the slightest amount of digging, gets really complicated really fast, right? I mean, there's that whole kind of teenagery thing of like, oh, it's so complicated, and it's like, well, it is, right? I mean, all of our lives are complicated, and I think we get into trouble when we think that it's just us, right? And that everything else is sort of flattened, right? And I guess, and that's kind of my take a
Mhm.
little bit on kind of the typical sighted person who hasn't spent any time um, with a blind person, right?
Mhm.
Or even thinking about reading a book by a blind
Mhm.
person, or not even imagining that they might encounter a story, say written by a journalist, um, that could be blind, right? That there's a nuance that gets lost
Mhm.
in these tropes that's especially like problematic with blind people, because I feel like we haven't had control over these tropes that are just so dominant, right? They're so pervasive in our Western culture. At least that's my argument, right? It feels very dominant to me, and so um, I think that it's kind of, yeah, it's just easier. I mean, maybe that's the simplest answer, and that because we don't have a lot of like blind creators or blind scientists out there, allowing for the kind of nuances that I really hope, will come around soon here, any day now. It's just easier to stick with kind of the all or nothing, that either you're blind or you're sighted. And then kind of along those lines, there's like this, you know, all or nothing in terms of like either sort of fetishizing
Mhm.
blindness on the one hand, like with the blind seer or the blind poet prophet, that kind of thing, and then sort of the pitiable spectacle, right? And there's kind of all
Mhm.
those vast dappled regions have everything to do about being a normal blind person, right? About all those realms of like being a blind mother, being a blind, father, being just a blind student, or whatever, all those things that are kind of the messiness of normal life, of so-called normal life, are sort of left out when we're so focused on those kind of extremes of of tropes or of ideology, I guess.
There's so many things. I mean, I wonder, I mean, you touched on this kind of lightly in the book, without, maybe you said as much as you wanted to say about it, but when you talk a little bit about your father and talk about him seeming unequipped to,
Yeah.
at the end of his life, for life in a wheelchair, and I mean, kind of along the lines of what you're just saying right now about, you describe the combination of like the shame of feeling of being disabled, which is kind of kind of produced or amplified, at least, or if not produced entirely, by the arrogance of the able-bodied, and then how difficult it is um, uh, to be gripped by a kind of um, shame, or uh, uh, and I was just curious in thinking about your dad, like, and a lot of people that I've known moving in and out of varying states of disability, like what, I mean, your book kind of already talks about this, but for those of us here who had, the people who haven't read it, like, I felt, you know, a ferocious question of just like, what on earth does it take to undo this?
Yes.
And, you know, what,
Ugh.
because it's not, it doesn't help anybody. Nobody does it help, you know, and everyone, especially as you talk about disability as a fluid category throughout a life, it, you know, that if you're lucky to you know, live long enough, or, you know, or have been born, you know, you'll move in and out of it. I wonder,
Yes.
I don't know if there's any, I mean, again, your book has thoughts on it, but if you wanted to say anything here about the undoing, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. And my dad, you know, here's where like ocularcentrism meets like ableism here, right? It's like my dad in his wheelchair, just so unhappy, right? And I mean, he was still trying to live life, but he was
Mhm.
very unhappy in the last few years. And he would say things like, I don't know what I'm complaining about because look at you, you know, and I'm like, what, but I'm fine.
Yeah,
You know, because
yeah,
it was like, it was just kind of this weird thing of, you know, that sort of um, like hierarchy of disabilities. It does seem
yeah,
like blindness has this like dubious distinction of being among the worst, you know, so that, you know, so that someone like my dad, you know, obviously I'm not going to
right,
fight him on it because he was so
right,
unhappy, but it was sort of like, it doesn't have to be this bad, you know,
yeah.
is kind of what I was always trying to explain to him. And,
Mhm.
you know, and I wasn't unhappy. And it kind of, it's not only, you know, it's not only somebody that like my dad who spent his whole life as sort of, you know, traveling the world and all this stuff and then ends up in a wheelchair. But I tell you what, just the other day, I was in the little town of Clayton where my mom lives, and these kids on skateboards were kind of walking down the street, and this one kid on a skateboard said to my partner, Alabaster, said, is she blind? And Alabaster says, well, you better ask her, you know, and he's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Are you blind? And I was like, you don't have to be sorry, you know, big smile, like I'm okay. And then even after that, he said, that is so sad, you know. And I was like, wait, I just had a couple beers and some dinner and I'm walking with my life partner, like there's nothing sad right now at all, there's nothing. So it's that intensity is definitely something that I'm trying to, you know, trying to unravel. It's like, why is there such this like knee-jerk reaction to blindness, and for sure other disabilities as well, you know, where it's like, oh, you must be walking around in like this pitiful state of like wanting to be normal or something, you know. And I mean, how do we unravel it? I keep going back to the practical stuff. Like we need to be able to have some control over our narratives, you know, and not to mention being in positions of power, you know, for to in order to sort of just by the very nature of us being there, and by power I don't, you know, I don't necessarily mean like you have to be, it doesn't have to be like the president or king or something, you know. It's like I keep kind of harping on the idea of, say, a blind scientist, you know, that I think is so foreign to people's ideas, but that can shift, you know, the questions that we ask, you know, that like a blind person doesn't have to be just like the specimen that needs to be cured, right? The blind person can also be the one asking interesting questions about human sight or some other aspect of humanity, you know. And I guess that's why I feel like there is this kind of very practical answer to that dismantling that I think you were asking about, so that we don't have to feel shame, right? I mean, that's the thing,
Right.
because
Yeah.
it's such a waste. Shame is such a waste.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting too, because I mean, I was really struck by, and I was really edified by, again, like how much of your book is devoted to, you know, pondering how fast the human mind can change or not change,
Hmm.
you know. And it's interesting because, you know, you spend time writing about people having difficulty learning to see post surgeries that have restored aspects of sight, and you spend a lot of very, again, edifying time describing, you know, how it's the mind that sees, not the eyes. And then but you also write about how swiftly people's brains can learn to compensate for lost sight. and you offer your own testimony on kind of vis-a-vis mobility, like wanting and learning to be blind better, and just describing the labor of learning Braille. And I just, I think, it was really interesting. I noticed myself kind of, I wouldn't even call it vacillating, because I don't think that they're opposed, but between this kind of like vast respect for the plasticity and possibility for change that you're describing, and then also recognizing the hardship when change is either too hard or not possible, or as in the case, as you're familiar with, I'm sure many people here are too, in disability studies, with, the idea of cure as, a kind of oppressive, not desired state either. And I just was interested how you're thinking or feeling these days on the question of adaptability, not necessarily about yourself, but just about kind of the way in which, what am I trying to say? Like the way in which our capacity to adapt, which often requires practice and patience at hard things, is very shaped by our mental state and by the forces that be telling us if we have the resources to, do we have the teacher to, like all the things that it takes, and how that mental state can be so debilitated by not having the pragmatic things that make that kind of difficult commitment to adaptation possible. I just wondered how you were thinking or feeling on this question now, about change.
Well, I mean, listen, there's no doubt that I continue to try and learn Braille. I mean, also it's one of those things where it's like I want it so bad, and yet as an adult, it's not only about my brain, which is of course less plastic than say a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, learning to read Braille, but also we just have a lot of stuff going on in our lives once we're adults, right? It's like you don't get the time to just go to school and spend 8 hours a day learning how to read, and so there is this feeling that I have in terms of just in a very personal way of really wanting to learn Braille, and at the same time feeling like it's a process that I need to be kind of gentle with myself about, because it is going to be harder. There's no doubt that I think probably people that have grown up and not, mastered reading in any capacity, either with your eyes or with your fingers or with your ears, that it's going to be a little harder when you're an adult. And I think kind of being kind, both to yourself and also sort of within the blind community, about like the fact that we're all going to need to do things differently. And just because you go blind, it does not mean that suddenly you're going to have, super other senses. It's not going to just happen overnight. It's something that develops. Now, the cool thing about brain plasticity is that I think that we are ready to adapt, right? I mean, that's like how humans have gotten along in an inhospitable world, is by being very adaptable, and that there are things that you can do to realize that some of the adaptability, I think you're right, is mental, right? Because I mean, I've done this with friends at parties before and just said, just close your eyes right now, and it's amazing. Like you instantaneously hear things that you didn't hear a second before, right? So that's kind of like attention, that kind of attention will lend itself eventually to your brain, adapting and stuff. So I think the biggest one of the biggest takeaways of that in my own mind, and that's kind of helped me, is this idea that I think I talk about it in the book. There's this guy named Jacob Twersky, who's a writer who kind of his lifespan like the 20th century, and he talks about going to school, in a blind school back in the 20s, I think, and 20s and 30s, and we have a new 20s. Now we're in the new 20s. I mean, the last 20s and 30s, the 1920s and 30s. He talks about some of the blind kids would call the ones that that were kind of bumbling into things, that weren't very good at being blind. He called them blindish, and my partner like very astutely said like, oh, right. So like being blind is a skill set, and I thought that was so great, because it's like, this idea that you need to learn to be blind, I think, is something that is vastly underrated in our society. You know, I talk about kind of practicing with the cane, you know, and how foreign that seems to a lot of sighted people. And so I guess there's that feeling that like suddenly everything is different when you're blind. I think that kind of ties into that dichotomy that we were talking about earlier, right? That like, oh, you're blind, well now da 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 da, like these things will happen to you, like you can hear people's heartbeat from 2 blocks away, or you can suddenly, you know, do all these things. But no, it's like you need to learn to be this new kind of perceiving creature, you know. Yeah.
I wonder when you talk really trenchantly about the difficulties that blind people face in terms of getting employment and things in the book, and then also about blind writers. And you've said several times here, and you know, about the need for more blind scientists, blind writers, blind everything. I also noticed in your acknowledgments that you seem, you know, to feel really positively about the experience you'd had with your agent and your editor, your publishing. I was wondering if you wanted to say anything more about the experience about bringing your book into the world, you know, because I mean, it seems very triumphant and beautiful, you know, in that way.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's the thing, but I am writing about blindness, right? I mean, I shudder to think what's going to happen when I decide to write about something else, you know. I mean, that's kind of a big thing in the book. I'm kind of lucky because, you know, like my agent found me through my writing at Catapult, and I was, you know, it was a blind writer's notebook, you know, it was kind of all on my sleeve, you know, the whole blindness thing. And so we'll see. I mean, even just feeling like I'm going to have a little more trouble with the novel that I am kind of working on, that's going to be a little bit harder of a sell. Because again, what is the actual experience of blind people? We really haven't seen it. We haven't seen like an own voices movement, right? I mean, with blind writers, and I think maybe it's starting certainly to happen with disabled writers, but we're kind of the new kids on the pride block, you know. I mean, I think we're still, you know, it's still pretty rare to see, you know, in writerly fellowships or even you know, journals and things like that, ask, you know, specifically, you know, in their statements of diversity mentioning disability, you know. So I think that yeah, until those kinds of things start to happen, it's going to be hard on the one hand to tell these other blind stories, and then also to tell stories that have nothing to do with blindness. And I talk in my introduction about this really kind of poignant quote from Helen Keller in her second memoir, which is called The World I Live In. And you know, everybody kind of has read The Story of My Life and the Miracle Worker, and she wrote The Story of My Life when she was like barely out of college. You know, she was like 22, 23, super young, and, you know, lived to be 87. So she had a long life and a very rich one. But I think a lot of people kind of keep her in that kind of, you know, miracle worker world. So just a few years later, in her preface to The World I Live In, she's got this really amazing quote that I kind of keep going back to. It was sort of one of the kernels of my play about her and stuff, of like, you know, saying something about the editors being so kind that they are probably right in thinking that nothing I have to say about the affairs of the universe would be interesting, you know. And she kind of talks about the things in her world in 1908 that were troubling her, including things that are in our world that are troubling us, like conservation of our natural resources and things like that, that she wanted to write about, and they just didn't want to hear it. They only wanted her to keep talking about the blindness, to stay in the memoir realm of things. And I think that is largely not very different than where we are now. You know, I mean, I love the blind memoir, right? I mean, I sprinkle the whole book with a lot of words from wonderful blind memoirs, but I think that when that's all that we're allowed to write, that's a problem, right? Yeah. So I think I'm lucky because I was able to at least a little bit kind of push against the memoir thing, but I'm still kind of firmly in the pocket of the blindness, and I'm still very much, you know, in the book. So we'll see. We'll see if my luck continues, I guess, is the answer
well,
to that.
I know that everyone, if you're, please throw things into the Q&A, because I'm about to, there's one in there now and I'm about to turn to it. But yeah, I really loved it when you described, when you talked about thinking back on your performances in your youth and saying, I marvel now at my bravery, you know, which
Oh
was
my
so
God, and I wasn't even that young, which is funny, but
it made me wonder. I mean, you mentioned a little bit, so you've talked about writing a novel, and you describe in the book, you know, different engagements with acting or sound art, maybe more recently, other things.
yeah.
I mean, I was so impressed by your book's writing that I just kind of felt like, oh, Leona's like, you know, going to be like just like nonfiction book after nonfiction book. So it's really interesting to me that you're saying that you are interested, that you're writing a novel. And I don't know if you just want to say anything else about that before I turn to the box here.
Ooh, before the box. Well, I mean, you know, what kills a project quicker than talking about it? But I will say that it's a long-suffering novel, and it's getting there. It's really getting there, I hope that it is going to be a kind of a fresh take on a couple of really interesting blind characters. So I call it a paranoid sci-fi. What was my tagline for it? Something about paranoid sci-fi spy novel. I think that's kind of what I'm going for. So we'll see.
Fantastic. No, I hate talking about things in progress. I just was more like, you seem very like, you know, you seem very, I mean, both at home and like narrative-ish nonfiction or analytical nonfiction, but also, you know, your interests in, you know, not always, but sometimes people are interested in the genres that they have spent time with, and your interest in Milton and in other, you know, and in genres that literally don't exist really anymore. I mean, no one writes, you know.
I am not going to write an epic poem. I think I can say that
right,
safely.
Exactly. Not that per se, but just kind
I'm
of,
all over the place, but not that all over the place.
Yeah. No, but I think it's, you know, I mean, the last thing I'll say is that I just really, part of the elegance was, you know, the obviously like ease and learnedness that you have with whether it's Shakespeare or, you know, a Greek drama or anything, and it just made it so, you know, I felt so inspired to revisit and reread even Paradise Lost. So that was really, you know,
wow, that's saying something.
Let me go to this Q&A box. There's like one comment here right now, so you guys put any in. It says, every Zoom call should feel like this. Accessible for all. Serious inspiration here. Thank you, Green Apple. For Leona, your thoughts, please, on the possibility of a bookstore library creating categories for sensory intelligence, like they have biography, art, etc.
Well, I definitely know that there's some people that think that there should be like a disability section, just like there is a, you know, women's studies section, and I think there might be some movement for that. It's tough. These kinds of questions are so tough because it's like you want things. I don't know. In this world that we live in, I feel like it's very easy to go very deep into something that's already important to you, and it's harder to find things, I think, that don't seem to immediately speak to you. You know, I mean, there's that kind of that whole talk. Speaking of novel writing and things like that, there's this whole kind of talk about relatability, you know, and I think it can be dangerous to some extent, because you start to feel like you're only writing for people that are already sort of either there or already interested, you know. So I wonder, like, I think it would be so interesting, you know, to have, I'm not sure if I exactly understand the question, but would it be like sort of there was a blind section in your local bookstore, which of course then you get into the whole fact of like, well, would they be accessible books? You know, because I do feel like, I love the independent bookstore and stuff, but it's hard as a blind reader to feel connected to your local bookstore because there aren't accessible books there. And what would a really, I guess what I have thought about more is like, what would it be like if we had sort of like an accessible area to bookstores, and I think libraries are starting to have this a little bit more, but what would it be like if we had, an ebook reader with a braille display at your local independent bookstore, that like you could kind of be browsing within the world of the book and be able to kind of participate in that way. So I guess that's stuff that I've thought about, but in terms of like a section, I don't know.
So Leona, she writes, not a blind section, just a section exploring the senses as a North Star.
Ah, right. So kind of, yeah, so sort of a sensory section. I like it. I would go to that section. I would go to that section.
All right, people keep throwing, I've got a lot of questions left to go, so I can keep asking, but anyone just put them in there too. And I guess I just wanted to, so, okay, one of my obsessions in this book was you were talking about Milton needing to be milked of his poetic lines, it was just, I was very fascinated by this, both because it, poses him as like an animal, but also poses him as a kind of like a lactating.
Should we explain this, Maggie? Should we,
yes,
should we explain this to the people, or like, what in the heck are you?
Okay, yeah. Well, see, now these are the questions in my like niche area of my questions. Yeah, okay.
No, I love it. So the thing is that Milton spent much of his life as a totally sighted person, and then lost his vision rather precipitously, like in his 40s, and so he was very famously composed Paradise Lost in the night when it was quiet, and then in the morning he would wait for his amanuensis of the day to come and milk him, and apparently that is actually what he would say, like he would want to be milked of, so the lines of poetry to be put into a pail and drunk or something. So there's the milking. Okay, now the question, Maggie.
Well, I guess it just was interesting. I mean, it's probably kind of narcissistically interesting because I have a little passage in the Argonauts about pumping milk from your breast while you're typing, and this kind of feeling of like machines taking out of you things. And so I've already thought about milking and language as kind of happening side by side or fused, but it made me really think that, all forms of writing, depend upon technology and some kind of prothesis. And I was very interested in your description when you talked about your own when you the part of the book where you say, let me tell you a little bit about how I'm writing this book, and then you described how you're writing it. And I thought that, I think, as you point out about smartphones and the advent of technology for everybody, and the kind of cyborgian quality that, everyone walking around with their earbuds or their prostheses has kind of normalized a lot of that. But it also made me realize that, like, I think a lot about when you described your capacity to blow through information really quickly on the internet because you have your speech output set fast. And it made me think, I think all the time about, because like occasionally I will admit freely that I feel like especially this past year in the pandemic, like that my brain has kind of been deranged from smartphone reading, such that like like if I pick up Henry James or something, I just feel very like my brain feels deranged, like sometimes by like the speed and the skimmingness way that I've been reading so much. And I think that what I'm trying to say is that through technology now, I think a lot of sighted people are also thinking a lot harder about what the technology they use to read and write is how it's interacting with them in a way that you are much more kind of astute and onto. And I'm just curious about how you think these days about your speech output and the speed, and about your words being read back to you without emotion, and like how and how and when do you choose to make changes in how it's going for you, you know?
Well, goodness, I mean, I think that technology, and especially sort of the digital era, has been so game changing for blind people that it's like, it's almost impossible for me to have the kind of the same perspective on technology as I think a lot of sighted people do, who for whom they always could just walk into a bookstore and pick up a book, you know, and now, I mean, you know, the much maligned ebook, I mean, it's just been amazing. You know, I mean, I can get a book, yeah, every time I talk about it, it makes me like a little teary-eyed, because I can get a book, you know, as soon as it comes out now. Whereas before, you know, I would have had to have been in the situation that Milton was in, which is waiting for somebody not only to milk him, but also to like read to him and stuff, you know, and that there was no other possibility. And so for me to kind of get upset or find technology as sort of the enemy, which I feel like that I hear that quite a bit, you know, and it feels very trendy to be like, I have a physical book, you know, and which is wonderful. Like a physical book is a wonderful thing. And I'd probably be that person, you know, if I was not a blind person. But I think maybe I'm trying to make the point in my book that, like, you know, what is accessible to one person and what feels comfortable for one person is not going to be the same thing that feels comfortable for somebody else. And that if we harp so much on like the vehicle of the text or whatever, then you know, then it disallows for conversations about the books we're reading, right? If I'm a sighted person and they're so intrigued about like how I'm reading, then how can we have like a kind of an equal discussion about the books that we are both reading, you know? And I don't know, I kind of went on my soapbox for that question. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I answered it, but
well, I think it's great, because I think what you're also doing, and you know, is you're I mean, your book does this too, but you can kind of sniff out the ableism and a lot of you know, just, you know, ignorant, not even well-intentioned, just kind of average writing about the, you know, about ways in which people presume things are accessible to be, you know, and then pontificate about the, you know, oh, the woe is us, or the woe is my brain, or the whatever, all these different things, as opposed to this kind of very galvanizing sense of, as you're saying, like, yes, these, you know, kind of like, get it how it works for you, and then now let's talk, you know.
yeah. And I mean, and the digital is such it really is kind of cool, because I mean, for one thing, I mean, audiobooks, I was speaking of going back to this whole idea of shame, you know, for so long when I had to have books on tape when I was in my 20s and 30s and stuff, it was so embarrassing. It was so shameful to me, you know, and now like audiobooks are, you know, are all the rage and quite normalized and stuff. And so, I mean, I think that the digital era has really made that possible, you know, to realize that reading comes, you know, at least right now, mainstream in two forms. And, you know, for me also, and for a lot of other blind readers, the digital makes braille, you know, we don't have to worry about braille books being produced, which is very costly. But if you have a braille display, then you can access any ebook with your braille display. So so basically a single digital text can be read by 3 different senses. And I think it's kind of, it's quite amazing. And I guess that's why I feel like it's been so great for blind people and especially blind readers, I will say. Blind readers and writers, it's been quite amazing. So I'm not gonna tear down technology anytime soon.
Well, about whether it's about gender and sexuality, blindness and enlightenment, Helen Keller jokes and humor, the idea of horror, I have a lot more questions, but well, that it's 7:02, so I'm going to give one last call out for a burning question from anybody here, and then after that, I guess we'll to, you know, for Green Apple's timeline, we'll shut down. If there's anything, Leona, you want to mention or say that we didn't get to, feel free.
Oh, goodness. No, this was so wonderful. And I so appreciate all your wonderful questions and for everybody being here, and Green Apple making this as accessible as it could possibly be. It's really a pleasure. So
Well, I
think
just
I'm
want to
good.
tell everybody, you know, the book is so wonderful, and I mean, like I said in the blurb, like you know, I both enjoyed it and I learned so much, and so I really I can't recommend it highly enough. So,
Oh, thanks, Maggie.
welcome, Leona.
Car here.
Hello, Car.
Hi, well, thank you both for joining us and for such a wonderful conversation. It was really a joy to listen to. And thank you, Beth, and thank you, Ari, for interpreting for
Yes.
us this evening. Thank you all out there on the internet for tuning in as well. I'm very appreciative. I wanted to let you folks know too that not only do we have this version of Leona's book that is in my hand here, but we also have a large print edition, and we have the audiobook available on our website, which Leona read yourself, correct?
Oh, great.
I did read it. I read it using an audio prompter. So it was kind of like reading and listening got collapsed in the recording of that audiobook for sure.
Wow. Well, that's a treat for us to be able to listen to you. Thank you. And with that being said, I'm very appreciative of all of you, and good night.
Oh, thanks, God.
And
Thanks,
all congratulations, Leona.
Oh, thanks, Maggie.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oops. Okay. Now I have the right button. Okay. Good night for real.
Good night for real.
Bye, Leona. Bye, Beth.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks all.